Welcome to Tabletop Tommies. I'm Jonny.
And I'm Phil.
And in today's episode, we're talking about the armies of Romania. I think first it'd be good to have a little bit of background on Romania in World War II. So over to our resident historian, Phil, if you'd be willing to talk us through it.
Cheers, Jonny. No pressure. So Romania in World War II, initially it stayed out of the war in 1939. A lot of the political stuff behind the scenes at that point was about its territorial integrity and not wanting to lose any of its territory as potentially the war developed. So initially it stayed out. After the fall of France, because France and Britain were certainly sympathetic towards Romania prior to 1939, with the fall of France, obviously Romania then was under pressure because the two of its kind of like backers almost, or guarantors, had gone. So it did then obviously side with Germany. Given where it is located in Europe, the Romanians were involved in the German invasion of Russia, the Soviet Union, and they were obviously involved around Stalingrad and southern Russia. Where it changed was around sort of 1943. So from 1943, after the Battle of Stalingrad, Russia was then pushing into Romania. And interestingly, at that time, Romania was also the second major Axis power in Europe following the armistice between the Allies and Italy. So from 1943, the Allies then start bombing Romania. And in 1944, Soviet armies invade the country. Very quickly, Soviets then are putting pressure on Romania, and the people of Romania are also putting pressure on the government. Romania surrenders and switches sides. So for the final part of the war, from August 1944 onwards, Romania is then part of the Allies, fighting alongside the Soviet Union forces until the end of the war in Europe.
Brilliant. So quite an interesting varied history there, where you've got, it's one of the few nations that fights on both sides of the war. And yes, it is covered in Bold Action. We've got rules for both the Axis Romanians and probably a lot fewer rules, but there are still some rules for the Allies, aren't there?
There are, yes. It's similar to Italy and Finland, where you can play them as both Axis and Allies, depending on which part of the war you're playing. And also, I guess, France, in terms of Vichy France in the mid-war period as well. So, yeah, they're interesting in that sense, yeah. And I guess from a historical perspective, a sort of political perspective, as you often find in the conflicts around World War II, their involvement initially is about their territory and either keeping hold of their territory in this case, or in the case of other countries, actually wanting to take back territory that previously had been part of the sovereign state. So yeah, it's not all just about fighting, is it? It's just about territory and natural resources and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's the classic thing when you start to dig into the motivations of individual nations. Suddenly, all of these alliances, it becomes more and more apparent how much each nation has its own priorities and motivations for fighting. Mm-hmm. And so this very simple narrative quickly breaks down, and it all starts to get a little bit murky and much grey, doesn't it?
Absolutely, 100%.
Jumping in, though, I think the best place to start is probably in the OG rules, the Armies of Italy and Axis, where you get all the rules to play Romanians as an Axis nation. They don't get a huge amount of national characteristics, do they?
No, they don't. And I think, to be fair, the OG rules for Romania are pretty bland, and I've never really looked at them up before Case Blue, to be honest, because they were fairly straightforward. In terms of the national special rules, you've got your Axis support rule, so you can take one extra unit from either the German list in the Bolt Action rulebook or the Armies of Germany book, or the Italian Eastern Front theatre selector from the Armies of Italy book. And you get the French artillery doctrine, which allows you to take one free inexperienced or regular artillery unit, which can be any anti-tank gun or field artillery piece in the Romanian army list, except for heavy artillery and German artillery.
Yeah,
and we've seen those before. We've seen the Axis support rules in Bulgaria and in Hungary, and obviously the free artillery piece. You see it in France, you see it in Belgium as well, don't you? So they're not unique. That's probably the best way of saying it. The initial OG rules are not unique at all.
Well, the one thing, as you said, neither of those rules were written especially for them. Mm-hmm. And so they're not exciting individually. The one thing that did excite me, having looked at them previously, is the idea of using them in tandem. Because if you really want to build a big gun line and you go into a single platoon event, it's one of the few cases where you can get both a free howitzer and you can use your German Axis support to take something like a Panzerwerfer or a Marder, something that equally is a big gun with long range, And where your opponent can only bring one tank and one artillery piece, it gives you that little edge. But obviously, the price you're paying for that is you haven't really got any special rules to bolster you.
Mm-hmm.
Should we jump into units?
Yeah, so the units themselves, they're fairly straightforward. You know, you've got your normal selection of officers, inexperienced, regular, veteran. Likewise with your medic, your forward observer. Obviously, with the recent updates, you can add, you know, your chaplain in and so on. So
Yeah, your HQ units are just basically your standard. The only thing of note is you don't get the air observer, presumably because the Romanian Air Force was quite small at this time.
yeah, I would expect so. Yeah, yeah.
But there must be some interesting infantry, I would imagine.
Well, you'd hope so, but again, not really. So your early war infantry section, they're regulars. They are armed with rifles. You can have an LMG if you want. You can your NCO comes with an SMG. You can make him, or you can give him a rifle if you want. You can give him anti-tank grenades. So you know, fairly standard for what you see with the minor nations from the original books.
Yeah. And you do get, so in addition to your sort of rifle sections, at your three different experience levels, you do also get cavalry, which sounds fun until you read their special rule, which is the
Yes.
rule that Hungarian cavalry used to suffer, which is that they're basically not allowed to charge into combat. And so the sort of the glorious cavalry charge for fun or for competitive reasons isn't allowed. And so you're paying the same points as everyone else for horses that are half as useful,
Mm-hmm.
if not
Mm-hmm.
less than half, to be honest, because they haven't really got, other than having a Panzerfaust.
I was going to say you can have a Panzerfaust in your cavalry section, but you need to dismount to fire it.
Yeah, and that is a problem. That's the big problem. So if you're just going to use them, I suppose, take regular 72 points plus your 5 points Panzerfaust, rush them straight at a tank. The thing is, you're going to miss with your one shot, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah, not a huge amount going on there. No. And then for your support weapons, you can take a medium machine gun team. You can take a Panzerschreck team if you want to. Can't take an AT rifle, which I thought was interesting. Given that AT rifles were prevalent at that time, you know, we're talking about, you know, sort of 1942, 1943. AT rifles are going to be massively prevalent.
Yeah, especially because they're owned by the French, and the French, I believe, were big into the anti-tank rifles.
Mhm.
They've got the French tanks coming up later, spoilers. And so I would think they'd also be getting anti-tank rifles from the French or from another source because, I mean, everyone had them at sort of end of World War One in the interwar period. It is a weird omission.
And then in terms of the other support weapons, you can take a sniper team at regular or veteran, and you can take all three mortars, which is interesting because you don't always see heavy mortars being available. So this time you can take a heavy mortar with them.
Yeah, it is one of the problems I find with the miners that you don't have a lot of anti-tank, and a
Mm.
heavy mortar would be a great addition for that purpose, as
Yes.
unreliable to hit as it is.
Mhm.
And so it is nice that they've got access to it. Just a bit of housekeeping jumping back. I think we jumped over the motorized infantry section. I mean, it's not a huge thing to miss out on because they're basically just regular veteran, 5 guys. You've got to pay 3 extra points because your NCO comes with an SMG. You can take it off for 3 and get the 3 points back if you want. The only thing of note with them is they can have 2 LMGs. So if you're into LMGs, that's the squad for you. And just an elaboration on the cavalry point. In the latest FAQ, the Hungarians lost that rule that made their cavalry useless.
Mm.
But the
Mhm.
Romanians and Bulgarians are still suffering from that.
Yeah.
Just to elaborate on the point that I made earlier about the Hungarians used to have that problem. So hopefully, I was going to say hopefully it'll be addressed next FAQ. Hopefully it'll be addressed in V3.
In V3. Yeah. The motorized infantry sped ahead of us. They were in the Opel trucks, and that's why we missed them. They were already shot and gone away.
Indeed.
Um, Artillery. So you've got your choice of light, medium, and heavy, and you can take spotters for all three, which is interesting. So you can take a spotter with the light howitzer because you don't always get to do that.
Interesting, but not hugely powerful. I would say that isn't, in it, on its own, not a reason to play Romania.
No, light AT or sorry, anti-tank guns. You can take a light AT gun, or you can take a medium anti-tank gun, which is the PaK 97/38.
Mm-hmm.
So from Germany, or you can take the TaK Resistor anti-tank gun, which is a heavy anti-tank gun, and this was designed by the Resistor to give the Romanian army a purpose-built anti-tank gun.
Very nice. You have got, everyone's current favourite in the meta for facing down the Armour 8s, an anti-aircraft gun, haven't you?
Yeah, you can take a light autocannon. So you can't take a heavy, but you can take a light autocannon. But you can upgrade it from a light to a heavy.
And only 10 points, which makes it 60 points total. I think that's slightly cheaper because normally the heavy has 4 crew and the light usually has 3. And so I think you're paying for the extra oomph, but not for the extra boots.
Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? Because the Porty the Porty autocannon, I think, is 60 points in some armies. So that's a bit skewed anyway, because that's obviously maneuverable and heavy autocannon. But I think you're right in terms of some of them are 65 for the static heavy autocannon. But yeah, autocannons are good. Particularly when we get to the case blue rules, you might want to start looking at your light autocannon. Spoiler alert.
Now you're throwing the spoilers in. So I think that's everything apart from the vehicles from the Armies of Italy and Axis, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And this is why I've sort of almost completely discounted them prior to Case Blue, unless you're looking at maybe theatre selectors in Fortress Budapest, because you literally get 2 options for armoured vehicles, which is your Renault R35 and your TACAM tank destroyer. There's no armoured car option as it is in a generic platoon from the original book. So you've either got a low velocity light anti-tank gun in the form of the Renault R35, or you've got the hull mounted medium AT gun on the TACAM tank destroyer, but it's 7+ and open topped.
So not a huge variety. They did change the R35 to a different entry from the same book though, didn't they?
So interestingly, the entry or the FAQ does change the entry for the Renault R35 slightly. It does say to use the captured R35 entry from the Armies of Italy section, which does significantly actually reduce the points cost, because it's 155 points regular in the Romania list and only 120 points for regular in the Armies of Italy list. It still has one-man turret. It has armoured all round. It has the low velocity anti-tank gun, but you can, if you want to, upgrade it for an extra 10 points to just a normal light anti-tank gun, and it is slow. So actually, for 130 points, you're getting a Armour 8 all-round vehicle with a light anti-tank gun, which isn't that bad at all, actually, and it does have a forward-facing hull MMG. So I take it back. That's actually quite good.
Yeah, that is tasty. 130 points for basically a anti-tank pillbox. I'm pretty tempted by that.
Yeah. I mean, there's still a lack of options because there are only 2 in the generic options from the OG book. So.
The TACAM in the original book isn't as interesting as the one that comes up later. Yes. But obviously we'll cover that when we get to it. Before we do, though, just a correction on myself. The heavy autocannon, Armies of Great Britain, is only 60 points. And so actually the Romanians are overpaying because they've only got the 3-man crew, 60 points, heavy autocannon, whereas the Brits get the 40mm Bofors for 60 points with 4 men. So not a huge difference. I don't think it's going to discourage people from taking it, but it is one of those cases where the miners don't get it as good as the Brits.
And hopefully, as you said earlier on in the episode, that V3 is a chance to kind of iron out all of these wrinkles, because these books have been written over 10 years or so, 10, 12 years. So there's going to be changes in terms of points, and the ripple through effect doesn't always get tracked through from each book and each FAQ and all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of, to cap off the OG list, as we're calling it, there's 2 transport options, which is a truck and an artillery tractor. No machine guns on either. However, FAQ also gives you a truck with a machine gun now for all nations, and a Jeep equivalent, basically a utility car. And so that does give you a little bit of a perk in the transport section. But again, it's not enough to shift me to them.
No, you could put your Panzerschreck team into your regular utility car that's been added from the FAQ, should you so want to. So you don't get a flamethrower team, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is... I think there might be one coming up, or was that the Hungarians who got it in a later book? Guess we'll find out when we get to it.
We'll find out when we get to Case Blue.
Before we do, though, just jumping into the theatre selectors, there isn't a huge amount in them that excites me. The only thing that I do quite like is in the sort of the captured vehicles or Axis vehicles in Romanian service, they've added clarity on sort of what type of vehicles fit this theme, which is nice. It means that people have a guide, so they're not building ridiculously inappropriate vehicles, sort of putting tigers in an early war list. Well, actually, you couldn't take a tiger; it's too good. But you could take a panther.
Yeah.
Putting a panther in an early war theatre selector doesn't make a lot of sense. And so it's nice that there's a bit of guidance, but it's not earth-shattering, is it?
No, but I say what is interesting as well is obviously there is no Romanian armored car in the generic list, but in the theatre selector you can take the 222 or the 223 and you use the profile from Germany, and that doesn't count as your Axis support option.
You know what? That's a great chat. I completely forgot about that because I've had this come up from Easy Army errors where because of that they put it in the generic platoon, which it's not a generic choice for the Romanians. And so it is actually a really big deal getting an armoured car because otherwise, as you said, you just don't have one.
No.
Should we go in order of publication or?
Yes, yeah, let's jump to Fortress Budapest.
Fabulous. So I guess jumping into the units, the one that excites me naturally is the Combat Pioneer section.
Of course.
Now you do have to take them at 7 men, which means you can only fit one section in a truck, which is a shame. But put your officer in there with them, boost the morale of the truck, more likely to come in from reserve or outflank. Other than that, it's a fairly standard unit. You've got you can have up to 4 SMGs on your NCO and the boys, flamethrower, light machine gun. Obviously, the use for these guys is you give them the flamethrower and potentially the Panzerfaust.
Yeah, and you can take them regular as well, so that is useful. You're not just having to take them as veteran engineers or pioneers.
Yeah, and then the slightly more interesting one, I'd say, is the Mountain Division, because they've got that move through rough ground as though it's open rule, which I always think this rule isn't. It's not as crisp as it could be because it's a bit sort of agree with the opponent what type of ground counts, but it is a really nice rule that they can just sort of run through the woods, charge. They can only have 4 SMGs, so they're not sort of universally tough fighters, but generally, unless you're fighting a combat-specific unit like Gurkhas, I imagine veterans with 4 SMGs, that's probably enough tough fighters to win most combats.
Yeah, I'd say so. And the Mountaineer rule is one of those interesting ones where depending on which book you read and depending on which unit you're looking at and which nation it's coming from, it changes subtly from book to book to book. Hopefully for V3, we'll have a standard, this is the Mountaineer rule. And if they want to include one of the alternatives to that, it's not called Mountaineer, it's called something else, but it has a similar but not the same interaction because, yeah, like you said, there's all these things about agree with your opponent whether or not this counts as terrain that you could run through, and it would be nicer to go any rough ground you can run through or only ground of this type you can run through, for example.
Yeah, and that'd be nice if V3 gives us more specific terrain rules. So splitting dense into sort of rubble versus woods or like broad categories. And so you could say that they can run through this broad category, but not this broad category. But I guess we'll see what happens. The final unit is the one that I like the most for Romanians, which is the Tacum. Very similar to the original entry. 140 points, 7+, open topped, which is why he's nice and cheap. But it's got a medium anti-tank gun. And it's basically a 25-pounder. Well, it's a Ziz 3. And so it can fire either as the medium anti-tank or as the light howitzer. And I love these guns that are a bit sort of versatile like this.
Yeah, I like this one. And it's definitely better than the one in the original book because it also has the whole mounted medium machine gun. And you've got that split profile. Yeah, I like that one.
And then this is where we get our opportunity to play them as allies, isn't it?
It is, and this is where it's interesting, and it will be interesting to see what happens with V3 as to where the current theatre selectors are represented, not obviously in the same format, but to what extent they carry through into V3, because the allied Romanian theatre selector is very, very powerful in V2.
Yeah, very much so. Do you want to explain the reason why it's so powerful?
So, as you often find with theatre selectors and some of the generic national special rules for some nations, it's the ability to take 3 units. So, if you're playing a 1,000-point game and you can take 1 or 2, for example, 3 units, you're no longer playing 1,000 v 1,000. You're playing 1,100 v 1,000 or more than 1,100 v 1,000. And this is something that you can do with the allied Romanian selector from Fortress Budapest. So the national special rule that allows you to do this is Stalin's cannon fodder. And what it says then is that for every 3 Romanian regular or inexperienced sections taken of the same type, a 4th section will be free. And this free section is identical to the cheapest squad purchased at the lowest experience level already chosen.
There's not a limit of 1 per platoon as well, which is the reason why
Yeah.
it can potentially become a bit ridiculous, especially if there's not a limit on the number of platoons, because you could potentially pay for 12 sections and get 4 free.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so with the theatre selector, your 2 compulsory infantry choices are either the late war infantry section or the mountain division section. So if you're going to lean in and take 6 units, so 2 from the core and 4 from the optional, to get those 2 extra units, one of those sort of sets of 3 is going to have to either be the late war infantry section or the mountain division section, which isn't too bad. You know, they're perfectly decent.
Well, it would have to be the late war infantry section because it has to be inexperienced or regular.
Ah, yes, you're right.
And
Yeah,
the mountain division, unfortunately, can only be veterans.
it's
So
only veteran.
one of your free units is going to be a little bit bland
Yeah,
because it's lit. But for holding objectives,
yeah, perfectly good. And yeah, it's a free squad.
yeah.
Where it gets really interesting is you can take the combat pioneer section as part of that 0 to 4. So you take 3 of them that you pay for, and then you get a 4th one free.
Yeah.
Everyone loves the free stuff, especially when it's got a flamethrower with it.
I mean, actually, what you could do is if your pioneers are your cheapest squad and you take 4 of them and you take 2 late war infantry squads that are slightly more expensive, then your cheapest squads of both 3 is your combat pioneers. So you get 2 free combat pioneers.
Stalin's cannon fodder for every 3 Romanian regular or inexperienced sections taken of the
Oh,
same type.
of the same type.
That's
That's the
the thing.
criteria that breaks it. Yeah.
You can only get 1 free pioneer squad.
Yeah. Per platoon.
Per platoon. Yeah.
Their other 2 national characteristics aren't particularly anything to write home about, are they? You get a commissar, which is nice, but you're not going to be taking in experienced squads because you can't in this selector. And so it's not like game changing that one. And
No,
the
but
other one,
it's not just a commissar. It is some of those units in that selector are taken from the armies of the Soviet Union, and they retain the unit special rules and the Soviet national special rule, Great Patriotic War. So it's not just that it's the free commissar. It's actually you're porting across the unit rules from the Soviet Union roster for specific units in that theatre selector, which is pretty good.
yeah, it's mainly you get the Su-76 and artillery and the commissar. I think that's all the ones that I can see. Have I missed any there?
No, I think that's right. Yeah, it's some of the artillery, some of the weapons. Komsomolets.
Just saw that myself. I was quite excited about that. The shame with that is because it's not unreliable, you're paying the same as a Bren. And so it's not as fun as the Finnish one where because it's unreliable, it becomes like ridiculously cheap.
Yeah.
I mean, and their final one is one that is very thematic,
Yes.
but not particularly game changing, which is that in close quarters against Hungarians, they're fanatic, which is very
Well,
thematic.
they're both fanatic, so they're equally fanatic in that situation.
Which is interesting because we've complained about national characteristics that nerf your opponent, and we've said that that's bad game writing because it makes your opponent feel bad. This one, you're actually bolstering your opponent. And so actually, I quite like that because I think that'll make your opponent. So it makes them buy into the combat a lot more, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's all for Fortress Budapest, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, but it's a great theatre selector, and you do see, or you certainly have, been under V2, where you can bring theatre selectors the ability to take those 2 extra squads if you've got enough points. If you're paying a 1250, 1250 dual platoon theatre selector event, it's like the holy grail because you can just take loads of free units. You can get some free pioneers. You've got decent options in terms of the armored vehicles and so on. So that is a very strong option under the current situation in V2.
Absolutely. And this is the way, in case it wasn't abundantly clear, this is how you play Romanians as an allied force. And so there currently isn't a way to play them generic as an allied force. So you're going to see this more at sort of your
Megatron 3000 and your English Open and the Welsh Open if Mark allows that, and similar events outside of the UK. Yeah,
absolutely. So I guess the last, but I imagine not the least source to look at is Case Blue. And if I'm not mistaken, they got some fun stuff in there.
So Case Blue, you get the Air Force Forward Observer. So we mentioned this earlier that you don't get it in the original rules. You do get it in Case Blue. You get a cavalry section, the Case Blue cavalry section, which does not allow you to charge because it still has that same rule that you may not move into contact with an enemy unit while mounted. You don't suffer the -1 to the order test for Rifle Reserve. Basically, they were used as sort of mobile hole pluggers, for want of a better phrase. So you're not taking them because they are tough fighters with a massive charge range and all that sort of jazz. You're taking them because you need a rapid reaction force to plug the line somewhere.
Yeah, which is a shame. I'd still rather charge than get, because it's great arriving from outflank more reliably, but if you're not going to have an impact on the game, then you might as well stay in reserve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You get your flamethrower team. So we mentioned earlier that wasn't originally available. You now get that. You get the tank hunters team. I like this one. So tank hunter team, they count as an tank unit for the purpose of the generic platoon. They're veterans. They're 2 men at 43 points. They have AT grenades. One has a pistol. One has an SMG. They get smoke grenades. So the unit deploys smoke grenades to infiltrate close to the target before launching their assault. And the surprise charge range of this unit is increased to 9 inches when they move to assault an enemy unit.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and they also are tough tank hunters. Now, you might be thinking, oh, it's only 2 men with AT grenades and tough tank hunters. Oh, great, they've got a 9-inch charge range. But when you look at the extra or the replacement National Special Rules that Case Blue adds, then it makes sense as to why this is definitely a unit worth looking at.
Oh, yeah, very cool. Just jumping back to the cavalry a second. What I've realised is the original cavalry from the Armies of Italy book have the exact same rule. You can't charge no -1 to arrive from reserve. So they've basically just duplicated the exact same squad at the exact same points, with the only additional option being an LMG and an SMG on your NCO. It's a shame that there could have been so many fun things they did with that, and it's a bit of a lost opportunity.
I guess it's one of these examples, and we've said this before, and other podcasts and so on have said it, where there is a lot of repetition of effectively the same unit across different campaign books. And I understand why that's the case, because the authors are often different and they're writing about a particular period of history, a particular front, a particular nation and units. So it makes sense to include them in the context of the book. But when you take it out of the book, put it into a generic platoon, you're like, oh look, it's another rifle section that are regular who can have an LMG, and in this case can be mounted on horses.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a case for V3 just having sort of universal entries for riflemen, and then you just add the late war over the top, and late war keyword gives you these additional options. That might be a really nice way to sort of slimline the rules whilst keeping all the variety.
Yeah, but give you the option and give you the variety. Absolutely, yeah. I do like that idea. Yeah.
The next section looks like a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is cool. So the mortar section. So it's a 4-man team, 60 points regular or 72 points veteran. NCO and 1 other man have rifles. There's a light mortar in there, and then the 4th person isn't armed with a rifle. He is the loader for the mortar. It allows you to split fire, so you can have the 2 guys with rifles firing at something, and then you can have the mortar obviously firing at something else. You can add up to 3 men, so you can take it up to 7 men. It reminds me of the grenadier sections, obviously in the Japanese list, or where you got the VB launchers in the likes of Belgium and France, for example.
Yeah, and this one caused a bit of a stir when it was first released, because the fact that it has a split fire special rule, when that's granted just naturally by the fact that you're firing, your light mortar always has that special rule by virtue of being indirect, made people think that maybe this is a bit of a V3 hint that this could become a universal special rule, the split fire.
Yeah, it could be, again, or it could just be that Alex Smith, the author of Case Blue, just put it in for the sake of clarity, and it was, or somebody added it in after Alex submitted the manuscript. We don't know, but we'll find out maybe in a few months' time.
Yeah, I'm leaning more towards that second option, that it's sort of just a clarifier rather than anything else. Yeah. But it would be quite a cool one to have. It'd be a nice sort of veteran ability that you could rush your squad up and half the squad shoot one way and half the squad shoot the other way, because it is very thematic that you're 10 men don't just fight as a 10-man
Hmm.
blob. They
Hmm.
split into sort of squads.
Yeah, yeah.
But jumping back to the rules, we've got one more entry, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, we've got one more. So this is the motorcycle reconnaissance section. 5 men. You can add up to five. So take it up to 10 men if you want. It's 75 points regular or 90 points veteran. So it's an expensive unit. The reason why it's expensive is that they're armed on motor. Sorry, they are riding on motorbikes, which is as you'd expect from a motorcycle reconnaissance section.
Yeah, and at 5 points a man as well. So it's motorcycles really are not a great option in the current rules
No.
because you can't shoot from them when you move. Whereas if it's in the vehicle section, suddenly you can. Um, they just, and it's an expensive way to get your men to a place on the battlefield quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, not my thing, that one. But the thing you've been raving about here is the national characteristics, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So as we know from the other minor nations in Case Blue, they do get some nice buffs. So for Romania, they get the improvised AT rule, which is the one that we've heard about a lot over the last few months. And this is the one whereby if you're firing a heavy weapon, so a weapon with a penetration value of less than +3, you may elect to re-roll the result when rolling to penetrate, which is great when you start looking at things like your light auto cannons and so on. The ones I like actually, so that is good. Don't get me wrong, that is a good one to have. The next two I really like. So lead from the
Mm,
front. Romanian officers within 12 inches of an enemy unit upgrade their morale bonus by +1. So that's encouraging you to obviously push forward with that Romanian officer, which I think could potentially synergize quite well with the combat pioneers from Fortress Budapest. So you're going to be taking pins as you go in as a pioneer unit, but if you're then looking to, if you've been forced to take morale checks, if you're taking casualties and so on, 7-man squads as a minimum for a pioneer squad is pretty big. So even if you lose 4 guys to force a morale check, if you've got the NCO, the flamethrower, and the loader left, it's still a viable option. Having that +1 buff from that morale bonus is nothing to be ignored.
absolutely, yeah. As soon as your truck arrives, rushes to within 12 of the enemy so that you can combat pioneers can get out, gets ambushed, you take a pin. Now, with a normal second lieutenant, those combat pioneers who are regular will be testing on a 9 to get out from the lieutenant. You're testing on a 10. The odds of you failing that are very slim. And
Mhm.
so that is actually quite a nice synergy with that. There is a bit of a weird quirk there, though, where those combat pioneers were intended for the Allied Romanian list, weren't they?
Yeah.
But we're going to throw them in generic with the Axis units.
Yes, and I guess this is the whole conversation about case blue national characteristics for all nations, not just Romania. It does say quite clearly the national special rules are written for use with the case blue theatre selectors and units. That was the intention of the author. Um, However, if people choose to use them with a generic platoon, for example, that's up to them, obviously. But it does slightly shift it. The national special rules are written in the context of a book with theatre selectors by the author because it's a period of time and all that kind of thing. We're now taking those sort of specific, you know, uh, quirks, if you like, or specific, points of reference in terms of um, uh, southern Russia, etc., 1942, 1943, and we're applying it to any Romanian army in the generic, by using the generic selector. It's something I'm not massively comfortable with, but I understand why you do it because it makes Romania much better, and therefore you're going to see them being taken, more often than not, um, into tournaments, and that's what we want to see. You want to see a spread of nations and people trying out different armies. So I understand it. Um,
Yeah. From my perspective, I think the fact they didn't get a flamethrower originally was noteworthy to us because we expect them to have one. And so
mm,
they, like, historically, they had those flamethrowers in the armory the whole time. The fact that they only suddenly appear in bolt action very, very late in the war, I wouldn't be hugely offended by someone throwing combat pioneers into an earlier war, like generic platoon. And I
mhm.
actually think, like, this is obviously we haven't seen all the national characteristics yet, so this is maybe sort of front loading a little bit, but I'm actually very happy with these national characteristics replacing the Romanian ones for generic because yes, you're getting some perks, but you're losing the perk of the Axis support and the free howitzer. And I
Yes.
think it's a fair trade. And I
Yeah.
think each one has its sort of its merits and its negatives. And it just comes down to like either what your play style is or what the theme is you're trying to do. And so I'm all for them personally.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'd agree. I don't have, I don't have a sort of fundamental, problem with them, but you can, we can understand how this issue, if you like, has arisen. It's because we're taking theatre specific or campaign book specific rules and units, and we're applying them into a generic platoon that allows you to take any unit from, you know, 1939 to 1945, or if you're talking about, Japan, you're taking them from 1913, whatever,
Yeah.
1932, if you're talking about the Manchurian type units. So yeah,
Yeah. This is where your TOs have to be a bit canny, isn't it? Because they have to recognize sort of rather than having a blanket rule that it's always like this,
mhm.
you recognize the situations where people are dropping paragurkas into inappropriate lists versus someone running a minor nation and finding that actually the later war characteristics or unit fits this theme better than the what is currently available.
Hmm.
And so I think, yeah, it's one for it's a grey.
Yeah.
But I've totally derailed us from the rest of the national characteristics, I think. So what's the next one, if you'd be
Yeah,
kind
so
enough?
the next one is also good. So yeah, the first two are good. The third one is good. So flank attack. This is great, and it's the sort of thing I can see you enjoying. Now that we've got pioneers being added from Fortress Budapest, you've got flamethrowers being added from Case Blue, and you've got vehicles, trucks with MMGs being added. Now you've got flank attack, which allows you to outflank one turn sooner. So if you're Romanians, for example, on turn two, you can outflank 24 inches on the board. Turn three, you can outflank 36. Turn four, you've got the full width of the board. That's massive if you build your list in a certain way to lean into that. That's huge.
That's absolutely amazing. Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
what you would hope for is that it would be brilliant with your cavalry, which is kind of what
Mhm.
the theme's supposed to be. But because your cavalry are absolutely useless, you're not going to use this for your cavalry. But it would have been really cool to push your cavalry on because they can't charge in that turn two because you
Mhm.
can't charge from
Yes,
off the table. So it
correct.
would have been really cool to have a really sort of like tactical outflank turn two. Your cavalry rush in, and then turn three suddenly you have to sort of
I
it's
mean that said, if it okay, so let's assume, actually no, ignore that because there's too many assumptions I'm about to make.
Uh, I mean, so where I actually see the use for this is exactly as you say. You put your flamethrower team or your combat pioneers, if you're allowing those, in a truck with an officer, so you're almost guaranteed to come on. It comes on turn two, and it's basically most of the way across the table with the 24 inches plus the 12-inch move.
Yeah, yeah.
Your opponent's really going to be on the back foot from the second turn. And quite often in a lot of these missions, like No Man's Land, they've spent the first turn just rallying, and so they're really not ready to be rushed on turn two.
And we can make it even better with the final national characteristic, which is hardy soldiers. And because this reflects their background as rural farming communities, they're accustomed to performing difficult manual labour in all weather conditions. In game turns, it allows you to remove a pin at the end of the Romanian turn for only one unit. So it's only one unit, but that's still cool.
Yeah, and that is obviously it's incredibly situational because it's a
Mm.
single unit once per turn.
Hmm.
But I can totally see a situation where your sort of your mission critical unit has a pin. So the classic situation, it's turn five going into turn six. You have a squad that's just behind the objective. It's got one pin on it. You need to get them on the objective turn six, and they nearly always fail that test when it's needed. But you just take the pin off at the end of turn five, get first dice, and they're on.
Yeah, it's cool. It's good.
Very good, yeah. And not overpowered either. I think if it was every single unit, too much, but that's just right.
And that's it.
Yep.
There's more there than I thought when I was looking at doing the research before this episode. I've never played Romanians. I think I've played against them once in a generic platoon tournament before Case Blue, and they were like, oh well, they're just worse Bulgarians or worse Hungarians at that point. They weren't particularly great at all. However, you start adding in your Fortress Budapest units and also then the Case Blue national characteristics. And especially, like you said, if you're talking about multiple platoon options rather than just a single platoon, they do start to become certainly much more interesting. Um, they don't have a massive amount of armored vehicles and so on. The Tokam is good, but it's a 7+ open topped vehicle. Yes, it has that great split profile in terms of the Ziz 3, the light howitzer and AT gun, which is great. Um, but you've got to be careful with it because it's vulnerable because it's only 7+ and it's open topped. So your placement and your fields of fire and so on are going to be really important there.
Yeah. The one thing that's interesting from the theatre selectors in Case Blue, they generally they're just sort of thematic. Not really much to write about. The main thing is that you can't take Panzerfaust in a lot of them because it's early war.
Correct. Yeah.
But the thing that is interesting is it does acknowledge the thing that we discussed, where a lot of them do have the combat pioneer section and the mountain division section in them.
Okay.
And so it's acknowledging our point that we were making earlier, that actually these units were available earlier in the war. They just haven't been represented yet.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So if you are thinking of running a Romanian army, I can absolutely recommend Great Escape Games' range of models. They've got some really nice both summer and winter uniform models. You've got all your different infantry sections, your support weapons, and also your vehicles as well. You can get it from Firestorm Games. So if it is something you want to look at further, please do consider using the link for Firestorm Games in the description.
Fantastic. As ever, thank you for listening. Please do share, like, and subscribe. Ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.